McKiernan, will be moderating this important discussion. We are both undergraduate students at Adelphi University. I am currently in my last semester as a criminal justice major with a focus in social and racial justice, and I serve as the president of the Criminal Justice Club, co-chair of the Artivism Club, and Adelphi University admissions ambassador. Rowan is a senior double major with psychology and criminal justice and is co-chair of the Artivism Club on campus. Before we introduce our guests, I would like to briefly discuss the topic of our discussion today. Immigration has long been an issue of contention in the United States and around the world. Currently, Ukrainians are fleeing their home country due to conflict that Russia began, and while many countries such as Poland open some with open arms, refugees that are non-white are facing increasing hostility in these regions. This is not new. We see this in the United States along the southern border, and it all started back in the 1800s with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And while President Kennedy and then President Johnson, after Kennedy's assassination, tried to get rid of the quota which disproportionately allowed white Europeans access to America while limiting the rest, it has not all worked out. In our discussion today, we hope to facilitate an open dialogue on how the works of our panelists have shaped the future in such a way that we are more accepting of all immigrants from all backgrounds. I would like to now introduce our guests. Tereza Buskova celebrates and reinterprets long-established customs with performance, print, and video. Her practice deals with ritual, tradition, and craft. Slavic rituals and traditions are often the starting point in her work. As a Birmingham-based Czech artist, she feels the need to explore other European customs and rituals. After researching how people faithfully practice their traditions and rituals, she then reinvents them with collaborators and local communities. Tereza often collaborates with Tina Francis, a stitch artist who believes that stitch is a language all in its own. It has the ability to entertain, educate, and communicate. Recently, they have collaborated on public art project Little Queens, celebrating and empowering women as well as stitching with Syrian refugees to create a canopy used in a ritualistic performance. Devin Thornburg is a senior adjunct professor of education at Adelphi University, teaching courses in psychology, culture, language, and learning, always within the frameworks of social justice and human rights. He has been involved in educational reform for 3 decades, writing about teacher-student relationships and roles in diverse settings. He served as part of the leadership team of the nonprofit addressing the challenges of educational equity and access, and has been deeply involved in collaborations with community-based organizations in the United States and other countries all of his professional life. For the past decade, his work has focused on the experience of immigrant and refugee students in educational settings, as well as those who educate them. In 2020, he began his work with LGBTQ asylum seekers in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. His latest book is on trust in learning, having conducted research in 8 countries on 4 continents. He collaborated on works published on global perspectives of adolescence, international teacher education, social media, and social justice. With degrees from Tulane, Harvard, and NYU, Dr. Thornburg is the father of 2 daughters who have taught him how much there is to learn in this world. Garyfalia Terizaki is an early education teacher and head of the children's section at Trifylia Library in Kalifatis, Greece. Ms. Terizaki works in a community setting with local Greek children, as well as migrants and refugees in an integrated setting. She creates programs using the power of art to teach the children and encourages the parents to participate in her multicultural projects with the hope of developing an environment of empathy and tolerance of this diverse multicultural environment. Stephanie Lake is faculty of the Department of Sociology and director of the Criminal Justice Program at Adelphi, a program she initiated in 2004. Her research areas include disparities in sentencing across race, ethnicity, and gender, and the policing of marginalized populations in the United States. Over the past 30 years, she has worked on issues relating to immigration and the law with Legal Aid San Jose, California, Safe Horizon Immigration Law Project in Brooklyn, and the Central American Refugee Center in Hempstead. Vincent Verdato is an undergraduate student at Adelphi University in the Criminal Justice Program. He is a sergeant in the United States military with 3 deployments, one to Guantanamo Bay, one to Afghanistan, and another to Iraq. After United States troops pulled out of Afghanistan, Vinny's unit worked in Qatar, assisting in the humanitarian mission that followed the withdrawal. And now I will turn it over to Rowan to start our discussion.
So the first questions that I have is going to be for Tereza. Specifically in your bio, we talked about the Little Queens project that you've done, and I was wondering what inspired you to do this project.
Sorry, was that for me?
Tereza?
I missed the beginning.
Yeah, so in your bio, we mentioned the Little Queens project that you took part in, and I was wondering what inspired you to do this project.
Hi, thank you for having me. I guess what inspired me was mainly my 2021 project called Hidden Mothers, where I started to work not only with my local communities, but I have developed very close partnership with local organizations supporting newly arrived families here in Birmingham. And so we are talking about refugee and migrants, and these are predominantly families who are settling here in the UK. It's their second home, and those organizations are not only supporting them in terms of housing, etc., but they are trying to engage them in creative art projects happening in their community. So Little Queens is a custom ritual, a tradition that comes from my homeland. And it's a ritual that I have been looking many years ago at, and I found it really, really striking because of the use of white costumes, and because this ritual only involves women, in particular young girls, adolescent girls. But for my project, Little Queens, I wanted to involve women, not only work with children, but I wanted to work with women of all ages and women from different cultures. So I guess what I do as an artist, I very much still celebrate my cultural background, and I don't want to just look at Central European traditions and rituals, but kind of all of the Slavic traditions, and I think, you know, I can still carry the identity and sort of the importance of these traditions, but show them in a new way, and show them in sort of, I guess, more global way, and through the folklore that comes from my country, I can express other, let's say, social issues, and I kind of use folklore as a vehicle to and a tool to express feelings and ideas, and kind of also the current situation in the world. And so yeah, if you want to have a look at the video, it's going to start now.
So just to keep up with the time frame, we are going to stop it here, but thank you so much for sharing that video with us. I do have one more question for you, Tereza. My question is, so why do you think this project is important, not just for immigrants and refugees, but for everybody?
I think it's important because we are sharing different cultures in our communities, and it took place in a small town outside of Birmingham, and it's a town I've never even been before, and I've been living here for 10 years, and it's a town that is kind of forgotten, and I deliberately choose places which are less visible. It's the same as who I work with. I predominantly choose to work with migrant refugee women who, same as with other mothers from anywhere around the world, they are hidden in the society. So those places that I choose are not the Polish city center of Birmingham, where everything happens. It's places where there's a high number of migrants living there, but for those reasons I found these places very exciting and interesting, and it's those places where I think we need to see projects like this happening, and we need to see art happening outside of a gallery space. We need to see the community not only witnessing the arts, but also being part of it. So for this project, I involved women from these specific groups that supports migrants and refugees, who collectively stitched a canopy, ceremonial canopy, which was carried in the final procession in West Bromwich.
Right. Well, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for answering my questions.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm now going to move on to Vincent. So Vincent, in your bio, we learned that you are a U.S. sergeant in the military. So I had some questions about that. So I know you worked with refugees in refugee camps, so I was wondering if you could tell us what the refugee camps were like.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to thank Professor Lake and Professor RG for having me. So, where should I? I think it's best to give context of where it started. So I was on my second deployment. I was in Afghanistan. I was in Kabul. I was in Kabul from February until late August, until the withdrawal. And during that time, I got to see not only when I was there initially, it was completely stable of a country, or as stable as it could be. And I was there, my job while there was I guarded the #2 general and the second in command in Afghanistan. So I was his personal security officer. So I basically followed this guy around all over the country. I was in Helmand province, Kandahar province, but mainly focused in Kabul. And then after the withdrawal, so after in late August, when the suicide bomber attacked in HKIA, we were redirected. So that involved, we loaded hundreds of thousands of refugees on planes, and then from there, they got sent to different military installations all over Europe and the Middle East. So after the withdrawal, my team was sent to Qatar and Doha, and there we were still working with the general, and then out of nowhere they said, hey, we need people to go work in refugee camps, and the initial breakdown was for one camp, which was about 3,500 refugees, there was only 5 US personnel until like more people came from other bases or from the United States. And these camps were built overnight by either Qatari contractors or Air Force personnel. And they were massive tents with air conditioning, and they got out as quick as they can. But basically all that happened was they would get from off the planes, they would come to a holding tent for a little bit to get screened for security purposes. Essentially anyone, for the most part, was getting onto the airfield that could, and then we had to vet them once they got to a different location. And then from these camps that I was in, they stayed for about a week. The conditions were as good as it could be. The main thing that we struggled with was you had a lot of high tensions between US personnel and the refugees between the suicide bomber and the 2 decades spent in a conflict zone that were ultimately cut short. So the conditions were as good as they could be, but we faced initially, we were extremely understaffed, so there was a lot of rioting. Refugees weren't either happy because they all thought they were going to the US, which unfortunately wasn't the case. I think about 3/4 were, the rest were sent to other NATO countries and countries that took. But the conditions were good, but the main thing was a lot of fighting, a lot of hostilities because they needed supplies, they needed food, and you have to think of just a logistical nightmare that came from hundreds of thousands of people coming into essentially a few countries, and then from there they would stay for about a week, and then they got sent to mainly Germany, to bases in Germany, where they would then get either to the United States or to other countries. So this is like, you can see the size of the tent on the picture on the right. That was like it at bare minimum capacity, and then towards the end of it, it looked more towards like the picture on the right where everyone was on top of each other. Yeah, so this is pictures on the right. I think there was dozens and dozens of tents per like little sectioned off camps. And then on the middle picture is where like we had a little aid station where they could get supplies and food, baby formula, clothes, flip-flops. And then on the right side is a picture I took of a baby that was laying amongst the people. And then yeah, just more pictures, and then that's me in the blue hat handing out food, and then you get an idea of how the conditions were.
Also, I read in the file that you sent us something about the U.S. conducting the largest major air evacuation. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so there's been many mass migrations for immigrants, especially in conflict zones. You saw it most recently, probably Syria, and to at least this, but now you obviously have Ukraine. But in Syria, you have essentially millions of displaced people. So in Afghanistan, what we gathered, because through the camps and now later reports, was that people were coming from all over the country to try and get to Kabul. So how it worked was these huge planes, C-17, C-130s would come, land on the airfields, and you guys may have seen the videos of the people on the airfield, the Afghans, and that was them essentially trying to get onto planes, but had to be a little more methodical in how we did it. It couldn't just be just get on a plane. When I was there, we found a lot of like, not that they were intended to be used, but a lot of the soldiers, brought weapons. They thought it was okay. They had grenades. We had to vet every single person that got onto a plane. So it was a little chaotic, and then it got so chaotic to where refugees would hold on inside of planes. A few ultimately died from hanging on and falling off planes. And then so that we conducted the largest air evacuation in history. Hundreds of thousands of people loaded onto planes and then sent to different countries. And then real quick, that on the right side is me with my linguist. He was in Kabul with us, and then his family, that's a picture of me and him. And that's my other linguist kids in hoodie. And then afterwards, we were sent to Baghdad, Iraq to continue on the security mission.
So then my last question for you is obviously the topic of immigration is a very controversial topic. So I was wondering if you could tell us about how you personally felt taking place in this mission.
It was very humbling because when I was there, I actually bumped into other soldiers that as dads fought in Afghanistan during the initial invasion. So it was like a generational war. So you had kids that were 18 and 19 years old now fighting the same war their dad started. And ultimately, you can look at it one of two ways: that it was good while we were there, and we prevented a lot of terror from happening, and we did do a lot of good. But ultimately, obviously the country is now still a terror state. But my personal opinion is that I think we can learn from history, especially after World War II, is that we have to take care of these refugees while they're in the United States currently, because most of them don't speak English, most of them have no formal education, most of them will be considered uneducated, and they lived in very poor conditions. So if they just get tossed back into Western society, there's no way for them to thrive or even sustain anything. So it's very important now that the government sets up as many programs to at least help them, at least give them a fighting chance. Because you have to think, if a 13-year-old kid comes here and has no formal education, where do you put him? So it's great you start him off. What schooling does he have, and family for their parents? Fortunately, the guys that I knew and keep in contact with, refugees, they all spoke English, so they're doing pretty well. But there was, for the large majority, I'd say 99% of them have no formal education or speak English, so you're gonna have a hard time.
Well, thank you so much for answering my questions. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your service.
I appreciate it, thanks.
So now I'm going to move on to Gary. I have a few questions for you. In your bio, we learned that you are a preschool teacher. That you're a preschool teacher, so I had a few questions about what you do with your students. So my first question is going to be, for what you do, what is most rewarding to you about working with immigrant and migrant children?
Well, hello, thank you for having me here. I would like to share an experience. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No?
Yes, I can hear you.
Last year, I had a student from Albania, and his parents could not read Greek, and the books we have in our lending library are only in Greek. So the student was on the autism spectrum and highly functional. And his mom told me that he didn't sit down to deal with the books he borrowed. Although I helped him choose books with a little text and more pictures, but he didn't even want to see the pictures because his mom didn't know how to read it to him, and he knew that books have texts and not just picture, at least most books. So I did something that I was so very proud of afterwards. I used stickers and to override the text using Latin characters, so the mother could read in Greek and the student can hear the fairy tale in the language that his classmates hear. And when he came to school, he was so happy that he could share at least one thought of that book, from that book, and he presented it to the plenary. And the child's mother was very, very moved, and now he is in elementary school, but he always considers me like his first and his favorite teacher. And I think that we are teachers, we are the key. And I believe that we have this power in our hands to change societies. We educated not just the children, but also their parents. When I realized that, I loved my job more, and but I wanted to help even more children and parents. So I got a secondment for the library. I have this feeling that when I work with immigrants or refugees, that it's like a blessing, you know, like it's like I know myself better when I work with those kids. I need a chance to understand other people through non-verbal ways. And I feel like being taught by those children and learn new things. I become richer person, and I experience the essence of education after all, and I feel so lucky. I don't know if I answered.
No, that was perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last question for you. So also in your bio, you had talked about how you work to develop empathy and tolerance amongst children, as well as their parents, and I was wondering if you could tell us what specific projects you do with the children in order to develop empathy and tolerance in them.
Okay, at school, I often use the theater game. I know that theater has power because students experience with their bodies, and the body has memory and knowledge through living, and experience lasts. It is internalized, you know, it's going through inside of us. Students don't feel like they're being taught because they're not being taught. They experience physically and spiritually. The whole being is there. And when the war broke out in Ukraine, the children heard so often the words refugees, war, death, uprising, and we read a very nice award-winning book about the second chances, a Greek book. And this book spoke about more specifically about the second chance that a house the house that was abandoned leaves. A family arrived from afar, and they were refugees. This is how we interpret it. So the children held the hero's suitcase in their hand. They took, and I took too, the steps on a small drawing papers, carefully trying not to fall into the sea, not to fall over the cliff, not to lose their loved ones. And when they reached in our circle, they talked about their experience. They told us how what they had in their suitcase, what was the most important thing to them, what did the experience they had on the road, what was their country like, what they left behind. And all the children wanted to experience the roles of the boy, the mother, the father, even the apple tree that blossomed and bore fruit, but also the house that was now living in its second chance and was happy. But there's not just the children, there are the parents too. So I encourage immigrant parents to take an active role in the parents associations. They have come to our school, they read fairy tales in their language, and we have found communalities in fairy tales and stories. I think the most basic factor for them is to be accepted is empathy. It is important that the teachers themselves first have empathy. Otherwise, we cannot cultivate it in our students. Empathy is not taught; it becomes an experience. That's all. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for answering my questions and for being here today.
Thank you.
For our remaining two panelists, I'm going to pass it off to Charles.
Thank you for all that have gone so far. So the next questions are for Dr. Thornburg. Dr. Thornburg, You are an educator in our education department, and I would like to ask how your work educating the educators of tomorrow has made for a better education for those that have needs for English as a second language, as Vinny was mentioning earlier, and other immigrant youth.
I hope I'm going to answer the question. Hello, everybody. I was so inspired by these earlier speakers. I have to tell you, I was so moved by them all. Thank you all for the work that you do. Thank you for your service. And thank you very much for making this panel happen. It's so important. So to answer the question about the educational aspect of this, it's probably useful for people to know that my own journey with regard to the work with immigrant and refugee populations really started in schools in the 1990s when I was at Adelphi, but it really took off when I became part of the NYU Metro Center for 5 years. I left Adelphi and started to work in areas of equity and social justice, which are very much at the core of my being and my sense of things. In April of 2001, I went to NYU, and in September 2001, you all know what happened. But what didn't really get enough coverage, as far as I was concerned, was the tremendous backlash against the Muslim community in our schools, particularly for those that were disenfranchised, meaning that they were not seen as being second or third generation and were recent immigrants or recent refugees from Muslim speaking countries. It was very hard to work in this center at NYU and not to focus almost exclusively on this in the weeks that followed 9/11. Since then, I have been involved in the work with schools around working with immigrant and refugee children, particularly given the sense of dislocation that they have or they can have. You know, if you think about it, for all of you who have made a move in your lives, imagine going to another country, and if it's another language and another culture, how dislocating it is, but also you have very little control over that. So teachers trying to understand that has been very eye-opening. With regard to the work that I'm doing in the recent years, I've increasingly become convinced that the universal language for all immigrants and all refugees has been the arts. I work with performing arts and visual arts, and I'm not an artist, but I certainly see the benefit to it in the work that we do as educators in a number of places. But the most compelling place for me was in a classroom where students don't have language and they can use art as a way to express and a way to communicate. That's huge. And what we've seen in recent years as well is how much art can be a way of building resilience. So this is a pitch for, on the 19th of November, a series of presentations of artists who are going to be talking about art and resilience from around the world. The work that I did on this book on trust really built out of the work that I realized that teachers in this country needed to be working with immigrants and refugees. And I'm putting the two together, but I want to say something about this. Historically, refugees were given a higher status. I don't know if people know this history, but having done extensive reading myself since then, I realized that part of the xenophobia that has developed and racism that has developed in this country about the populations is that oftentimes they don't see themselves necessarily as being distinct as categories, that people who are immigrants oftentimes they feel that they're compelled to leave their countries if the State Department doesn't designate them as having come from a country that is at risk. They could be seen as being immigrants. This has become particularly important in my work in the last 3 years through the Livermore Global Scholars in particular, but I am working with a nonprofit that's international called Safe Place, and they are developing for LGBTQ populations from around the world an educational program that is remote. It's one of the benefits of Zoom, and there have been now 19 of these programs that are a series of 10 weeks long, and half of the time, honestly, is spent doing the arts, sharing music, sharing culture, sharing stories. As the previous speaker had said, that stories are so important in terms of feeling a sense of roots, feeling a sense of connection with one's culture and communicating about one's culture. And I have a clue that I probably have spoken too long, and I'm sorry I don't have visuals. I promise to get to people who are on an attendance list some visual material. It just did not occur to me to have them available, but I will absolutely do that. But please come on the 19th of November to hear stories about how art has transformed immigrants, refugees, and indigenous people.
Thank you so much. You bring up so many important points, particularly about how this country was so xenophobic and racist towards the Muslim communities directly following and in the years since 9/11. So thank you for your work and thank you for your perspective. My next question for you, Dr. Thornburg, is what do you believe the role of the education system in the United States should be in not only teaching English as a second language to students who need that, but also ensuring students of European backgrounds, that is, white students, are creators of a progressive rather than a regressive future?
So I guess the best way to answer that question is probably to share a story. Maybe this will give you the answer that would be helpful. I worked recently with a public school in Brooklyn, and in that Brooklyn school are children from a number of countries, but the two most prominent countries are Russia and Ukraine. And what has happened in that school is that the parent communities are so divided that children who were best friends are not able to be together in the school without being told that you can't be friends with this child because they're from Ukraine. The immigrant and refugee population there is huge. And the most important thing that I've learned in my work with this school is that if educators don't take the risk of addressing how hard this must be for both sides and getting some dialogue going, then there is not going to be any dialogue and continued fractions will happen. And just so you know, the outcome of this was that teachers who are drawn from those communities, Ukraine and Russia, started telling their stories to each other in the school about their histories, about their families that they had never shared before. And it opened the door for parents to be able to talk to one another and the children to start to be together. It's not saying that it's all great, but it is saying that it's a significant step. And I think education has a mandate, honestly, to educate all children. I mean, this is a federal law that we follow. And to have children being able to be in school in a way that integrates them well, I think goes through arts and goes through stories. And I think that we have the opportunity to take that first step.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That is a really great story. I really hope that we do have more of a progressive future and it does start with that discussion. So my last question to you, Dr. Thornburg, is how has your work in countries other than the United States influenced your work on not only the education sector within the United States, but using the sociological imagination? For those that do not know, that means seeing the world with fresh eyes. Other aspects of the immigration system in the United States.
The last part was that, is there segregation in the US schools? Is that what you were asking?
The last part was like, how do you use the sociological imagination, which is seeing the world with fresh eyes, to see other aspects of the immigration system in the United States? Like, how has your work been influenced in other countries?
So this has really been hard, I have to tell you, because I'm not trained as a cultural anthropologist, and writing a book that was looking at a concept such as trust and going into countries that I had never been in before, nor knowing their language before, meant that I needed to be respectful of indigenous knowledge. I had to be respectful of the fact that I might not interpret something very well. I did it because I believe that teachers in this country are so starved for knowledge about the countries and the cultures that they're serving. So I went with intentionality to countries that have large immigrant refugee populations coming into this country to look at their educational systems and how they develop trust. And what I found was that trust is very much a value-based experience. It's an emotional experience. It's very tied up with empathy, as the previous speaker said. But the way that looks in any given culture, in any given context, may look very different. And so one of the things that I think is important for educators is to get into the communities and know the communities that they're serving with much more depth and much more respect than we do now. There are many teachers who are drawn from other parts of, New York, just taking New York as an example, that don't ever get into the community to get to know the communities that they're serving. The capacity to do that is what makes an educational system alive and connected to those that they're serving. And that requires going into churches, going into synagogues, going into community centers, going into, and there's a lot of challenges with that in terms of resources, in terms of safety. But ultimately, if you get a clearer sense of what's happening in the community, wherever you are, it's going to make a difference in the experience of the children and their learning.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think that if teachers might go into their communities and actually lived or just learned from those communities, our education system would be in a better place. So thank you, Dr. Thornburg, for your insight. My first question to you, Dr. Lake, is after seeing you in the classroom, after being a product of your program, which you started in 2004, how do you use art as a power for social transformation when educating the leaders of tomorrow on issues of refugees and immigration?
Thank you, Charles. I debated whether or not to show some of the images, just because in putting this together last night, I do need to warn students that one of the images that you've probably seen, because it's iconic, is really hard. It's really hard to take. So I wanted to just give that caveat. One of the things we've discovered as social scientists, and especially as someone who deals with numbers as a criminologist, is that you can give someone all the data and the facts, and it may not have the impact that you would hope. And that social psychology tells us a lot about that. The refugee and displaced persons crisis has reached a breaking point. We have over 100 million displaced persons in the world for the first time in history. And that's a number that is just hard to wrap your head around. It's hard to get folks to feel compassion when they feel overwhelmed by so many other issues going on. And you may recall that the Syrian, that they referenced earlier, the Syrian civil war, which has been going on for 10 years now, is the source of the largest displaced persons, both internally and internationally, crisis in the world. And one of the ways the data has shown that you can get people at a minimum to care, but also to help out, is by not necessarily focusing on the overwhelming numbers, but by allowing them to feel empathy for individuals. So some of the artwork that we've used in trying to get this the point across, what I'm going to get to eventually is dispelling some of the myths about refugees and the immigration crisis. But the image that served to really bring home the situation with the immigration crisis was this. This is 3-year-old Ayman Kurdi, who was with his family coming on a boat from Syria to Greece, and the boat capsized. And that image alone, which is so hard to look at, it's hard for me to look at now, really helped to get people to see how, while there are plenty of stereotypes about why people leave countries, why they become refugees, that for many folks, the idea of taking your children onto a raft and going across the ocean to a place where you're not sure they'll even accept you is very desperate. So, and you guys can see now why I hesitated showing up, because every time I see that, it's hard to look at. Here's another example of art that can be used to change people's minds. Let me ask the students what they think's going on here. This is Banksy, by the way. You've all heard of Banksy? Okay, so what's going on here? Who is that? Who's the person carrying the oldie time computer?
Apple.
An Apple computer. Yes?
Steve Jobs.
Yeah. So why the heck is Steve Jobs skulking around carrying a 1980s version of his Apple computer? And that's a drawing, obviously. Thanks, Cedric. What the heck is Steve Jobs doing? Isn't he like a he passed away, multi-billionaire? What else was Steve Jobs? Steve Jobs is Syrian. He was adopted, but his family came over as refugees from Syria. And so that's what's going on in this image, and that is something that, it's an image that causes you to stop in your tracks and go, wait a second. So what myth might that dispel? What's one of the myths we have about people who seek refugee status or asylum status in the United States? Oh, really?
That they don't want to work.
Yeah.
They don't want to work hard.
Okay, that they don't want to work hard, that they're leeches on society, that they take more than they give, that they're a burden on the countries, their host countries that take them in, which is one of the many myths that I was going to get to, but I know Charles will kill me if I don't allow him to ask specific questions, which I will ignore and just go on my own rant.
In Dr. Lake fashion. Thank you so much for your answer on that. Your work is really important in the classroom. So my second question to you is there a particular piece of work maybe a legal case while you were working at Legal Aid, which, for those unfamiliar, is an organization which provides aid for those unable to access the legal system, which does disproportionately involve immigrant and other minority groups, that particularly opened your eyes even further to the barriers immigrants and refugees have within the United States?
Okay, so I'm challenged with the technology, so instead of showing the image, I'm just going to talk about it. I worked in San Jose, California with Legal Aid in dealing with at the time, in 1989, the largest refugee population in that part of Northern California were Vietnamese and people from Latin America. And for those of you all who are very young, who don't remember, after the Vietnam War, there was a large exodus of people from Vietnam. And back then, as opposed to today, the United States did welcome large numbers of Vietnamese refugees. And one of the images, and we can ask some of the older folks if they recall, one of the images that really got people's attention about the plight of folks from Vietnam that caused people to stop in their tracks, similar to the Hyman picture, was, do y'all remember the image that it was on the cover of Time, and it was one of those images that just stopped you in your tracks? The little girl. Yeah. The 9-year-old Vietnamese girl who had her clothes burned off from napalm. She was running from a napalm attack. And for those who don't know what napalm is, apparently I just found this out, random trivia question. All of the napalm that exists in the world is made in New Jersey. It's jellied gasoline. And the purpose, ostensibly, for its use in Vietnam was for deforestation, just defoliation of the forest. They could see, the bombers could see what they were bombing and where people were hiding. But on the human body, it burns your skin, obviously. It can burn all the way through to your internal organs. And the jelly part of it makes it extra insidious because you can't wipe it off. You go to wipe it off and it's jelly. So that image back then was inspirational to many people in our organization in helping to get the word out and to get people to feel more welcoming toward the Vietnamese population. We had similar issues with getting these kids in schools who didn't speak the language, helping them to adjust. There's so many issues involved with trying to help refugees. And so I thought one of the best ways in light of what we did back then and are doing still today is to talk a little bit about some myths about refugees. And one of the things I think, just, aside from what we did in the 1980s, when we did take a large number of Vietnamese refugees and Cuban refugees who were fleeing Castro's Cuba. In the years since, we all know immigration is a hot button issue in politics, and whenever politics gets involved, there's a lot of misinformation and fear-mongering. So I just wanted to go through a couple of the myths that folks might think of. For example, the fact that the largest number of displaced persons arrive on our shores in the United States. And in fact, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The vast majority, over 86% of displaced persons end up in countries close to them, and that makes sense. You cross the border from Afghanistan, and you're in Pakistan. Pakistan takes far more of Afghan refugees than the United States. In fact, over the years, the United States, although the president and Congress commit each year to a certain number of refugees, Biden committed to 125,000 last year. We actually welcomed 25,000, so we fell way short. And it's a complicated process, which is another myth, that folks just arrive and they're like, okay, give me my benefits and I get to stay here forever. It's an incredibly arduous process. The average refugee spends about 20 years being repatriated, either repatriated back to their country of origin or assimilated into a new country. It's a legal status, refugee. The UN. The first step is to go through the UN, and after you go to the UN, High Commission for Refugees, the case is sent to the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and you have to fall into one of 5 categories. You either have to have faced persecution, and they define that pretty narrowly. Persecution based on your race, religion, national origin, political opinion, or your membership in a social group. And you have to provide evidence of this. So it's not so much that you just show up and you're like, hey, I'm here. It's a pretty arduous process. Like I said before, we are at a breaking point with 100 million displaced persons in the United States. But the vast majority of those go to low income or what we call developing nations, not to the wealthy countries, not to the US. Germany is the only wealthy developed nation that has taken in a significant number of refugees from Syria. Poland is the recent example of a country that has taken in a relatively large number of Ukrainian refugees, but the US falls well below, not only in raw numbers, but as a percentage of our population. Countries like Uganda take in more. Lebanon has its own refugee and displaced person situation. They are among the countries, Aruba and Lebanon, per capita. They have the densest level of refugees. And these are people struggling to feed, house, clothe their own people. So that's a lesson we can learn from. The Republic of Congo takes in more refugees as a rate. So it's one of those things that we really need to consider when we think about who we imagine ourselves to be versus who we actually are. One of the other statistics that sadly you'll hear, I heard about one today, driving to school today, because we're in election season, which is silly season, right? So you hear about all the commercials, is that refugees and immigration in general, but refugees in particular, are going to cause increases in crime. I know, I got my Izzy right there. Who else can I call on? We haven't gotten to it yet, so I won't call on you, but Izzy was in class last semester. What do we know about immigration and crime? Do immigrants increase crime rates?
There's no causation on it.
Not only is there no causation, every study that's been done has shown that increased immigration has a leveling effect. It lowers the overall crime rate. Immigrants have lower rates of crime than native-born Americans, whether you're talking about migrants, and there's a difference between a migrant, a person who, in theory, voluntarily leaves their home for a better opportunity somewhere else, or a refugee who is someone, as I stated earlier, falls into one of those categories of persecuted persons. In some countries, like Ben was saying, in Afghanistan, you have a large percentage of people who don't speak the language, who are unskilled or uneducated, but in many other parts of the world, you have people who are highly educated and highly skilled who come to the United States, like Steve Jobs, and innovate. They have higher rates of starting companies, innovating. And so the idea that increasing immigration will, there are issues involved, obviously, with serving large numbers of immigrants or refugees. But one of those issues is not crime. Of course, you can take an example, which is what they do, anomalous example of a refugee or an immigrant who is allowed to stay in the United States and then commits a crime. We call that an outlier, statistical outlier, doesn't fit the pattern. Again, in those places like Detroit and Atlanta that have welcomed large numbers of refugees, following large influx of refugees, the crime rates actually fell. So it's difficult to make that argument that somehow you're going to cause the United States to become less safe if you allow more people in, when all the evidence says the opposite. The other myth is that they take a lot of resources. Now, there is some truth to this in that in allowing people in, welcoming people in, providing services, there is an initial cost up front, but there's also long-term investment, and like I said before, immigrants of all stripes, refugees included, pay taxes, and they put billions of dollars into the US economy. And so in the long run, it's an investment in our future that pays off from an initial cost in terms of providing education, healthcare, and other services. I'm trying to think of, can you all think of any other myths or claims about refugees or immigrants or a question you might have? What about gaming the system? The idea that people show up and they're like, yeah, I'm gonna, get a better deal in the United States. First thing you think of is we don't take that many people, very low number statistically. And B, like I said before, it is a very arduous process. It's almost impossible to game the system. There are all kinds of loopholes you have to jump through, evidence you have to show, and even then, many folks are repatriated and sent back to their original country.
Thank you so much for your insightful answer, Dr. Lake. My last question to you, and we only have a few more minutes, so we'll try and keep this one short a little bit. I love you, though. Through your work at these different organizations, working with the issue of immigration and the law, what do you think needs to be done for those seeking refuge from the southern border to make our country more accessible and safer for them?
That's a tough one. I mean, I as an educator, I always think the answer is to dispel myths and to reveal the rich history of how immigrants to this country have benefited the US. But as the social science has demonstrated, sometimes you need images, sometimes you need stories. And so I encourage people to watch documentaries that focus on an individual family. I have a couple of them on our website for both classes, the Crime and Punishment and the Contemporary Developments class. Sometimes, last year or 2 years ago, the image of folks crossing the border and being rounded up by vigilantes, using whips on horses. That was a weird one, which get people to think like, okay, what would it take for me to take my child and walk 1,000 miles through very inhospitable topography, not to mention the inhospitality of crossing the border? What would it take? What would I be willing to risk? And what would it take for me to risk that? And then once folks get to the United States, there's a whole host of other issues, as we've seen with recent stunts pulled by the governor of one state who took the folks who entered in a different state and sent them to another state. Now, you could probably see how his logic was, well, why are we always dealing with immigrants? Why don't we send them to these quote-unquote blue states? Martha's Vineyard was the place where they sent people. And New York. And you might have heard the mayor, Adams, recently declared a state of emergency because it is overwhelming. If you're not prepared, and hundreds, in this case it was hundreds, and ultimately I don't know how many it was, thousands of people entering New York, if you're not prepared for it, it can be overwhelming and it can be a crisis. So the states of Texas and Florida do need our help. Florida doesn't have as many as they claim. It's really Texas. Texas and California have the most percentage-wise of people entering, displaced persons entering. So we do need more resources. But so the solution, education, compassion, empathy, use the arts to try to get into people's hearts, to block out the ideologues and the imagery of criminal elements coming to take your stuff. I have to learn that as a person who deals in numbers all the time, I have to learn that that's not always going to work, throwing numbers at people. Instead, use images, use powerful, artistic, creative expression. Music. You guys listen to music? I didn't play it because I don't know the MIA. Is it Mia or is it MIA? Rose laughing at me. She has a song which was very powerful. Is it MIA?
I have no idea. The question was funny.
I think she does the rap. I'm not sure. I'll have to ask my nephew Brendan later. Okay, back to you, Charles.
Thank you. Education is extraordinarily important. As a product of the American educational system, I can attest to the whitewashing of history, not only with Black history, but with those of immigrant communities, and it is extraordinarily disappointing to see, and so this does need to change. Thank you so much for your insight, Dr. Lake. Now I will move on to some questions for everyone. Why is this not working? We are running out of time, but so just keep it short. But my first question is, how does your work or experience break from misconceptions concerning refugees and immigration? Why is it important for you to show this angle? So anyone can take a jab at it.
I already covered mine, so you guys? Dave?
Could you repeat that again?
So how does your work or experience break from misconceptions concerning refugees and immigration? Why is it important for you to show this angle?
So I think it's a misconception, but it's also like a personal belief when it comes down to refugees and immigration, because there is the political side of it, but you also have to remember the humanitarian side of it, that we're all humans, and not that my politics or anything has really changed, but seeing it firsthand and seeing the struggle and the death and destruction of what a war can do, and imagine waiting online for days on end, and now the Taliban's taken over, like for instance, from where I was, you could see Taliban fighters, they were like the security on the base now, right? So they're literally trying to just free oppression and trying to get to a better place. Imagine you could see like the gate, and like you wait there for days and days. So the length people are willing to go, it kind of takes your politics out of it, and you just want to be like a good person, but there's always a double-edged sword with how you feel and what's right. So.
Thank you, Minnie. I'm actually going to flip the script since we only have 4 minutes left, and we want to open it up to our people here in person as well as our audience on Zoom, and see if anyone has any questions that they personally would like to ask our panelists. Alicia.
My class, any questions or comments?
If you have a question, we have a plan.
Oh, you got a plan. Jahim always has good questions.
Ah, yes, you get to go home with a plan.
Look, guys, look at it.
Breathe new life into this
Well,
plan.
you know what we'll do? First of all, thank you everyone for coming today. This is the Fall Arts Festival kickoff. It is hosted by Artivism. I do want to say that Rowan and Charles set all these questions up. They were in complete control of this. We just kind of provided so thank you, and they'll be graduating soon, so you have this experience. It wasn't an easy one, right? So we will do what we do in Artivism, is a takeaway, okay? So rather than wait for you to ask questions, the takeaway for today, like we
just
do
go
in
down the
class.
room. Your takeaway from today.
Just one little point.
Pass it down. One
Could be a word.
Tremendous hope in you.
Ah, beautiful. Yeah, oh, you don't need to, you could just, yeah, that's
Use the
okay,
mic
go
so
ahead.
some people can hear it.
Because then they can hear you on Zoom.
Just say it out loud.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, this was like very interesting and like hearing everyone's different perspectives and like art and everything, so like it was nice to
You got it, you got it.
yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
What I got out of this is art has no language barrier. That's how you said
Something I got out of it was just the different perspectives of immigration, not just in our country, but how it affects each other. We don't talk about that enough.
I kind of agree with Izzy. I feel like I don't really know much about it, so I got a lot of information out of it, hearing everybody's perspective, because they don't really talk about it much, and to hear it from everybody and to see it in pictures and images, I feel like that's a great way to start and to really gain people to understand more and more about it.
I took away, I agree with Professor Lake about how dispelling myths is good, and what you said about how first generation immigrants have the least chance for criminality and how second and third it increases exponentially. And like dispelling a myth like that is like really important to change perspective surrounding immigrants and refugees. Thank you.
I thought it was really interesting seeing refugees from this light, because usually I feel like social media shows them in like a negative point of view, because like, you know, how it's had a negative impact on the US, but it was just really interesting seeing this side.
This whole thing was kind of important, in my opinion, because like seeing how art is impacted in all these countries, and how like even for instance like in Vietnam War with the picture being taken, it's like impactful, I guess, because America's like perception of the war changed dramatically.
I thought the pictures were pretty important, especially in these slides, just seeing all of it firsthand, you know, especially for you, most of them are hard. There's also like that, oh, I helped them, but then the harsh reality of the reasons why I have to help them, because no one cares over them. So it's good to see that people are trying to make a change at least.
It just kind of felt inspired by all the refugees and like people's point of view, because my father was a refugee in Cyprus invasion, yeah. And it was kind of just motivational and to see how people were fighting, and my father kind of fought too, so it's kind of like survive and live and get to America and get a citizenship and all that, and to see the problems going on with refugees and immigrants kind of like obsessed me, but hopefully someday we can come together and solve the problems going on.
Thank you. I'll just take a second here to say, be leaders, not followers. Like you were saying with social media, don't just repost. Think of what your opinion. Be like, hold on, I'm not going to follow this chain. I'm going to put something else that will bring in another angle. That would be one of my key takeaways.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here, everybody at home, our panelists from afar, from Britain, from Greece, Dr. Thornburg. Okay, right following this event, there is the open mic. It'll probably be in a few minutes. Yes, at 1:45, yeah, at 1:45. Please, when you, so this room, it'll be 1:45, open mic. If you want to take a break, come back. Please grab a plant.
And tomorrow is the Fall Arts Festival Chalk Up, so there are many events throughout the day from 10 a.m. to I think the last one's at 6 or something. So definitely come out. The Criminal Justice Club, in collaboration with the Artivism Club, will be in front of the Sorbo Library. We will be doing something social justice related. Even if you're not an artist, just come out and support and lend a hand. I know there's the Walk with the Mall, I believe from 4 to 5 around campus, so definitely come with that. Yeah, it's on the schedule. So just check the Artivism schedule And definitely, we hope to see you tomorrow and for our open mic in 15 minutes. Thank you for coming.
You guys, these are nature's air purifiers.
Thank you, Tereza.
Come on, nature's air purifier.
Thank you.
These are nature, they clean the air.